everyone to this panel on how to secure and sustain supply chain of critical metals or minerals. My name is Federico Magalini from DSS Plus, a consulting company headquartered here in Switzerland, even if we are a global consulting firm with office scattered all over the globe. I'm here today with 4 other friends, colleagues, distinguished speakers, and I will let introduce themselves in a bit. While we start, I would just like to remind ourselves why we are here today. And I was discussing and joking with my colleague David earlier today. I think it was 2007. We were at this conference in the past was having a different name. And I remember at that time the keynote speaker had the presentation and was the title was War on Raw Materials. And now, of course, nowadays using the word war is a little bit odd because we know what's going on not far from here. At the same time, we also know the geopolitical implication of that event, that war on the supply chain of certain metals. Nowadays, I would say in 2023, we know that for key strategic metal, and I'm saying key strategic metal in particular for the decarbonization and the clean economy, we have seen an increasing rise of the value of the market. As you can see, in 2023, the market doubled, reaching almost $220 billion of value. And the interesting thing is that there are different industries that are now connected. We have the supply, we have the demand, and more we have the end of life, the recycling, that are more and more connected. The demand for metals like nickel, cobalt, lithium, rare earth increased massively in the last 5 years. And as you can see, for most of those metals, the share of the metals extracted is representing quite an interesting share for clean tech application. This, of course, for those companies that mining, and we will learn maybe more later, is good news, because we saw the value of those commodities increasing over the last couple of years, which is good news. And at the same time, we see that more and more there is interest even in closing the loop, keeping those metals in the supply chain once we made the very first big effort, even in terms of carbon emission, of extracting and refining them. And as you can see, I just using some of the data from the recent EIA report, in particular, primary extraction of lithium, refining and recycling, investment in recycling technology over the last couple of years increased substantially. And that's why today we decided to bring together a couple of representatives of stakeholders that are playing different role in the value chain to have an open discussion about what's needed to make this supply chain more resilient, making sure there is the demand, we know it's growing, but at the same time there is supply for metals that will be sustainable. It's not meant to be a presentation and you listen. Is meant to be an interactive section, as interactive as possible. The first half an hour will be a little bit the chat between myself and the panelists, but feel free anytime to raise your hand and ask questions. The same counts for those that are listening, let's say, online. I don't want to take more time of myself just speaking and standing here. So I will let the panelists to present themselves. As you can see here, we have a chart with their names and the company they are working for. And now let's start with Alison. Introduce themselves, explain in a nutshell what they are doing, the role of their company in the supply chain, and then we get it going. So Alison, please start with your explain a little bit who you are and your background.
Excellent, thank you. So my name's Alison George, and I work for an organisation called the Development Partner Institute. And my role is the head of programs and initiatives. And what that means is DPI essentially exists to have dialogue and conversations, where we were founded by one of the people who you might be familiar with, Mark Cuttafani, who was the former CEO of Anglo American. And he felt that what's important is to have new types of conversations, in particular free, prior and informed consent. All of these issues will, of course, help to increase resilience of supply chains in the long run. So we're an organization that really focuses on discussion, but turning those discussions into tangible projects. And that's my role. I think I'll stop there because I could go on. And of course, along the mine and value chain. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. We'll follow, let's say, the order of the chair in the seat. So, will James.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. So, my name is James Nicholson. I'm head of social responsibility at Trafigura. Trafigura is one of the world's largest commodity trading houses. We have a big office here in Geneva. So, we handle something in the region of 1 million tons of oil and petroleum products, metals and minerals, gas, and also power, actually, every single day of the year. Providing those materials, we're purchasing those materials in this context, for example, from mine site or indeed anywhere else in the chain, and then delivering that into markets around the world.
Thank you, James. So, now, Janne.
Thank you. After the avalanche of information and non-pretty photos from the global supply chain, I'm proud to represent a company that uses bacterial leaching to extract valuable metals like nickel and cobalt. My name is Janne Palosari. I'm a Chief Commercial Officer at Terrafame, a company mining and integrated asset in Europe, Finland.
Finally, Marco.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marco Bersani. I'm a startup founder, and I've actually 2 startups that are operating in the relevant sector. At Circular Materials, we recover valuable metals from the very complex waste coming from all the metallurgical processes. So we recover metal from aqueous streams, and that probably is a small amount with respect to the amount of metals these guys next to me are dealing with. But these are metals with a high technical value and a massive environmental impact potential, because it's very easy to get rid of 1,000 kilos of nickel in 1 billion cubic meters of water, because you can just dump them down the drain, and creating a massive environmental and health hazard in the environment. And another company I started is active in providing technological solution for the traceability of raw materials across the value chain, providing very robust markers that can withstand also subsequent cycle of elaboration. And I'm really curious to see if I can bring this up to this panel. Thanks.
Thank you, Marco. So now I'd really like to start this conversation about the need of having, a supply chain which is resilient, and there are different implication and probably leverage or pushes nowadays on the moment. I was reflecting this morning while flying here the fact that in the past it was quite common to say, okay, there is a supply chain, a sequence of steps from the mining, the refining, the use, and it was pretty common, the understanding that, yes, everyone is having his role in supply chain, there is some form of cooperation. And now if you look what's happening with certain countries that were used to have the mining and then admitting that, okay, refining is happening somewhere else, now there is effort to keep the material in the country, to do more of the activities, keep more value in the country. So somehow jeopardizes this geopolitical flow of metals, of materials. So I wanted to ask you from your view, from your perspective, looking also the role you represent the supply chain, what are the main elements that are changing this kind of dynamics? What are the main implication of this new way of doing business in the supply chain of those technical metals? I don't know if you want to start probably with Janne, as you are doing the very first step of mining.
Well, thank you for the first opportunity. When it comes to the traceability, we had a big year 21 at Terrafame with 2 major automotive companies, being French companies Renault and Stellantis, announcing a direct agreement to purchase nickel from Terrafame. And if thinking the customer justification at the time, I think the traceability triggered by the chip shortage incidents at the time was sort of triggering also the commercial need to understand what's happening in the supply chain with your tier 1s, tier 3 suppliers. This should not be overlooked, because it was not only the ambition to create traceability for the value chain, but also secure a robust supply chain looking forward.
And James, from your, you usually trade commodities. You're involved in this trading. How do you see this the need of establishing more resilient supply chain? What are the main elements that are supporting or pushing or pulling for this? And what type of changes do you see in the companies?
Sure. So I've been at Trafigura for about 13 years, and I have never been more engaged in conversations across the whole chain than I am now, in relation to social impacts associated with what we source, we store, we blend, we deliver. So that's a really positive step. And I think for many people in the room, you've experienced that yourselves. Suddenly, people are taking a real interest in the concept of responsible sourcing. I mean, Yanni, Yanni and I work together. We have conversations where, I mean, as Yanni just illustrated, you've got big brands for the first time ever taking a real interest in what's going on the ground. Again, a really positive step, because it should have always been that way, right? But my role is as looking at social performance is ensuring that those big brands can really understand what's happening on the ground, and they can put it in context. Those big brands that may come to the conversation with very Western demands on certification, on health and safety, etc. And in the case of Terrafame, those needs, whether it's for certification standards or whatever, can be translated or accommodated very easily. But actually, the majority of the metal supply chain isn't like that. And it is much harder to join the dots between those in the chain and to ensure that the information flows from, indeed, point of source to point of consumption, whether it's into a Polestar prospectus or whatever. So my role has changed massively from, firstly, accommodating these many conversations with the downstream, understanding what's important to them, but now going back to point of source and trying to join the dots, trying to ensure that those small or mid-tier mining houses can actually respond in the way they should, making sure the data flows, and above all, making sure they're performing. And I regret to say that it's not as easy as it is with Terrafame, where indeed we say this matters. Yanni takes that information. Okay, right, these guys are really interested in water consumption or whatever. We'll respond to that. Actually, for the mid-tier, particularly the small-scale mines, it's immensely challenging. We're having conversations with the downstream for the first time ever. They've never heard of GRI. They've never heard of ICMM, EITI, whatever. And it's now on us as the guys in the middle of the chain actually to work hard to make sure those needs are understood and translated and acted on.
Alison, we were discussing earlier when you were looking at your past experience. So you have been also involved in the past in advising, countries or governments, especially in Africa, which nowadays we know they're very rich in natural resources, about how to shape policy. And my question is, how do you see the role of policy in shaping the resilient supply chain? We see more and more countries making even bold move, ban on export of non-refining material, or trying effort to keep materials in the country and recycle in the country, even when they don't have technological options to do that. How do you see, looking also at your past experience, the role of policy in shaping this supply chain resilience?
I think that it depends on the capacity of policy as well, because there's the development of policies and then there's the implementation. And I think that with my experience, for example, in Rwanda, which sits next to DRC, and where there is a clear vision and clear steps, and the government has said that you know, mining is a priority or tourism is a priority. If you work within that context, then I think it's a lot easier to have policy developed that directly impacts socioeconomic development. Also, I think that the mining value chain, and for countries that I've worked in, there's a lot of asymmetry of information across the mining supply chain between companies, between different parts of the supply chain, but especially where countries don't necessarily have knowledge or awareness about the resource that they have. And especially with trading, they don't actually have knowledge or awareness about what they're selling and for what price. So where the country has a vision and you can sit down and plan, that's when I've seen the most real tangible ways to develop policies. And if they're directly linked to economic linkages as well. So if you're thinking about mining, for example, if you think about manufacturing and also supply of electricity to, you know, put in place, like in Rwanda, smelters that can, you know, bring things in, all of these things need to go together. But my most real example is seeing a country with a clear vision of where it's going. If I just speak to DPI a little bit, to go back to your first point about geopolitics and the implications and supply chains. So DPI exists as a, you know, our intention is to be a neutral platform. So where you see a direct reaction to multilaterals, world organizations or bilaterals, different governments, or reactions to the West from maybe the global South, or, you know, with Russia and all these dynamics we have, DPI is essentially a space where we want different people to come together, different organizations to come together. And we also, a little bit distinct from ICMM, but just having the ideas or discussions such as responsible sourcing, there's standards, there's lack of alignment, but having a cohesive vision together and then developing. So I have to speak to DPI as well. So just to say that's our intention, that's what we do. And we're hearing conversations about shortening of supply chains, creating beneficiation, and we're actually creating projects, especially in Zambia, to deliver that. We also hear conversations around free, prior and informed consent. So we work in that space in North America. So we're learning and speaking to young people and communities. So for example, in North America, their focus is on, you know, 7 generations. So we're living in the time of Christopher Columbus now. So what we do today impacts 7 generations. And we're thinking, how do we integrate that into our thinking about how mining works? We're also speaking to different research institutions, exploration geologists, about how they approach the exploration phase before they mine. So that's really how we are fixed and working. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. And Marco, I mean, we discussed, I mean, we started from the role of policy, and of course, there is, at least here in EU, a big role of policy even in pushing or pulling for adoption of recycled content, especially when it comes to batteries, which is an object which is consuming quite a lot of the metals we mentioned earlier. You of course develop an innovative technology or approach to recycle the metals contained in batteries, or some in the elements that are resulting from the recyclings. How do you see this introduction of a minimum recycled content in the batteries in the context of, will this make the supply chain more resilient, or do you see there are other blockers that will have to be tackled somehow?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, we have in metal recycling, in battery recycling, in setting the threshold for minimum recycled content within the next generation of battery and battery manufacturing. Keep in mind that nickel is nickel, whether it comes from battery, comes from steel, comes from surface treatment. Okay, so we have to think approaching the issue of supplying these specific critical metals, especially in a world where innovative chemistries are continuously coming up, and where the portfolio relevant metal might change within the next year, couple of years, 5 years. So in building a global, a robust supply chain across the whole periodic table, we need to be able to intercept every secondary stream of valuable and technologically relevant metals. And this is pretty much what we're trying to do. So not just to focus on nickel, on lithium, of cobalt, but extend it further and broader.
Janne, I know when we discussed a couple of days ago that Terrafame made a big move into introduction of recycled content into the material you are trading. I want maybe to give the audience here a little bit of insights into that type of operation or change of operation, and maybe explain a little bit how the big OEMs that push for this change in operation or change in approach are how far is their support going? How do you see, will they shape the strategy of the organization even more compared to the past?
Thank you. I heard two good words said by the colleagues: shortening the supply chain, and of course the recycling. And we have had a very tangible project introducing a recycled component or recycled feed to our primary processing. You can do this contractual wise and creating a lot of transparency, knowing your primary feed is coming from one source and part of your secondary feed is within the same supply. Having this recycled component embedded in Terrafame's future production has been a big baby for myself, understanding that there seem to be material streams that for the efficient processing are worthwhile recycling all the way this far upstream as the nickel sulfate production. And to support this type of shortenings of the value chain, we are a little bit immature in the industry, having the standards for reporting platforms to make it all even more traceable. But I think the first movers are actually moving by establishing the contractual setup when there's the minimum number of participants involved.
And James, I mean, when you talk about trading, we are talking about ownership of the metals you trade, and when it comes to the recyclings and trading of waste, again, you're probably moving towards a world where more and more interested not only on the minor material but also on the post-consumer, because it's a very valuable source of of metals, of feedstock for either for a recycling company like those adopting technology of Marco, or directly players like Terrafame. How do you see this world somehow changing to embrace more a circular vision, so that it's not just trading the first part of the supply chain, but it's trading more and more products and waste at the end of this of the beautiful useful life cycle?
Yeah, I think Marco is far better placed to talk about sort of the growth of recycling and its importance. From a trader's perspective, we trade a huge range of materials, and where we take material by and selling it is, shall we say, flexible. Nonetheless, the brutal reality right now is that I regret to say recycling is a very small component of the global supply chain. So nothing but scope for improvement. So that's exciting. The bulk of our business is more on the primary side, for sure. But it's Trafigura is, the concept is certainly not new to us, and indeed we trade recycled materials of many different types. It's a growing business opportunity from our side. It's could be quite interesting. And I think that if I may, I'm just going to sort of slightly pivot on the conversation, because I think what we can't lose sight of, and my mind is still whirring from the earlier presentation by Serdar in the last session, is we can't lose sight of, while the need to shift into recycled material is plain to see in every part of our lives, what we can't lose sight of is the massive developmental potential of materials that are required for the transition. And whether it's cobalt or copper, I think many people in the room now will have a real interest in ensuring that those materials are used as a vector for development. rather than the opposite, which is what, tragically we saw too much of. So excited by the prospect of recycling. It is a relatively small piece of the pie at the moment, surely growing. Let's not lose sight of what we are doing at the moment, what we need right now, which is primary material, but ensure that that material actually has a massively positive developmental impact for the future. Well, yeah, for today.
And the question is, are we fast enough to, pick up the pace or make sure we can supply the demand that is foreseen? And if you think are not fast enough to cope with that demand, what is needed?
Well, if I'm jumping on, sure you got,
Oh, no,
got
I mean,
views, but I think that
I don't claim to have the answers.
no. Let's see. We're not fast enough at the moment. In the numbers that we're seeing in terms of this massive uptick in consumption, in need, is just out of this world. And one of the subjects I've talked on quite a lot recently is just the need for all of us to be incredibly pragmatic around conditions as to where this material originates from. That's not to say we're going to accept material that is produced in where there are egregious human rights violations. Absolutely not. But we have to get behind the global south to actually ensure that that material can be mined in a responsible manner and can furnish the world as a whole with its metals needs. I don't know what the stats are, the number of mines that we need by tomorrow to make this happen, but it's a scary prospect and we are a long way off. Whether it's recycling, that'll help us along the way for sure, but there's real urgency.
And Alison, one of the reasons you explained earlier of DPI is also to create this platform where challenges can be discussed along the supply chain, seeing how you can connect the dots and explain why certain activities, certain actions, certain measures, even drastic, are needed. I wanted to ask you if you can share in some of the recent projects or activities or engagement you had, which are the key priorities or the burning element that are somehow easier to communicate, that people understand in an easy or without too much effort, and which are on the other hand the most difficult one to communicate or to channel?
Yeah, I think firstly, mining, oil and gas is quite opaque. So although we live and breathe mining and have done from the beginning of time, it has this mystical smokes and mirrors effect to the layperson. So even I'm sure our partners that we live with might not even know that much about mining. I was speaking to some geologists the other day, and their little girl said, "Oh, I'd like to do X, Y, Z." And her mum said, "Oh, that's a geologist. That's what I do." But there was just this disconnect, even though she's living and breathing with this child. So I think that when you talk about breaking down information and having these neutral platforms, we have one of the things that we believe in at DPI. So I've worked with the World Bank and some of these other organizations which have done good things, but they're quite big bureaucracies in terms of getting things done. So DPI wants to do things at speed and to pilot new ideas and just test things. So one of the things that we created was something called the Innovation and Research Battlefield. So, we have all these mining conferences across the world, and this one takes place at Mining Indaba in Africa, although it's not just localized to there. It's an annual competition, and we pose a question and we ask young people in particular, or an older person with a new idea or wanting to revamp their idea, to come forward. And the methodology that we use, and in particular, you get high scoring if your answer is linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, if it involves the mining value chain, if you can involve research institutions, tech companies, new ways of working. the burning question that we've chosen for the 2024 battlefield for this competition is what innovations are possible for collaboration with artisanal and small scale miners and large scale mining for the energy transition. So that was something that was so close to my heart to do. And that's why I loved that presentation, because there's this idea that there's a separation between large scale mines and artisanal miners. No, they're integrated and almost sometimes one in the same. So that was a burning question. And when you ask, is it complex for people to get? No, I think sometimes people can hide behind esoteric or really intellectual ideas, but your litmus test is, are you able to break down that complex information, if you call it complex, in a way that has people understand what they need to do for the energy transition, or has people understand what they need to recycle, and if there is transparency, data transparency between data environmentalists, tech companies, oil companies, fossil fuels, all of those things. And so we open this up and invite people to come together and essentially answer that question. So we run it on an annual basis, just to say, and we've partnered with BHP Explore, who have a similar program for junior mining companies. But imagine that you've got an idea and then it gets financed or funded, like the things for the energy transition. You win $25,000, and we ran that in 2022, and the question then was post-mine economies, so the legacy mines, you know, what would you do in the buckets of ESG? And we had lots of people come through, and it's exciting as well. We don't make it doom and gloom. And then another thing is we have something called the Responsible Sourcing Coalition. So you imagine that we're full to the brim with standards and misalignment and asymmetrical information. And we invite the mining value chain to come and discuss, but also to create projects that aren't necessarily, that probably sit on the periphery. So one of them is we're dealing with structural inequality across the mining value chain. And we're working with a car company who's an end user. And it could almost be a Pandora's box for them, so I won't name them, because what's great is that they have been encouraged to explore concepts and get visibility and traceability across their supply chain, but explore concepts like race, which also are used in decision making. We might not talk about it, and we might call it all these other names, but just dealing with that fair and square. Also looking at the macro and micro drivers like the asymmetry of information, some of the health and economic things. So this car company is walking the walk with us, and we're going to be doing a case study, and we'll publish that in time to come. So it's that experimentation to do something differently, and accept, instead of just leaving it, you know, on the shelf. And then your question, are we going fast enough? Well, we could try out new things, and perhaps we'll get different answers.
Okay, but while I encourage, you know, everyone in the room to also think, if you have questions to, you know, stimulate further debate, just raise your hand, speak up. And before giving you the answer, I have one last question from my hand. I wanted to ask Jan, more and more we see companies, automotive players, doing vertical integration. Either, you know, they buy a mine to secure access to lithium, or they start doing recycling, so, which means to a certain extent start doing the job of someone else along the supply chain. So how difficult do you think is for a company to do this vertical integration on one hand, so starting to do your job, and how on the other hand are you instead trying to develop partnerships so that everyone is keeping the focus what they do best, rather than trying to start someone else's job? What's your experience on that?
To me, it sounds very much like the last word, shortening the supply chain. So as a OEM or as a supply chain, controlling the whole supply chain, in my view, doesn't actually take the jobs from the processes that do the work, but perhaps create the transparency in order for the principal to package things the way they deem necessary, with the right portions of coming from right geological locations, as an example, for the risk management. But really the principal should be, in my view, in control of what is happening in their supply chain. taking a flashback 10 years back, I think big OEMs were quite happy for the tier 1 to be completely audited, providing a certain level of transparency to what's happening with the tier 2s, tier 3s. But today, I'm personally very happy seeing the trend and commitment that the principal is responsible what's going in their product, which they then sell to us consumers.
Please just maybe say your name and your company organization. So
should I press the button or is it not enough?
I just better the pressing the button.
Okay. Hello, my name is Politen Allen. I'm studying in the University of Applied Sciences in Norway, doing my PhD there, and I work with integrated assessment models, modeling global extraction of minerals, resources, fossil fuels, and market prices as well. And we look also at future demand predictions. And my question would be, when we see the supply shortages, and this is probably directed to James as well, don't you expect that the material prices will rise to a level where like consumption will maybe unviable and like really hard to supply to some industry sectors that will be not in the position to afford the mineral prices that we will see in the future? Because when we do the projections, we see shortages in copper, lithium, and nickel developing in the next 15 to 20 years, especially with renewable energy transition happening right now.
Please, yeah, please.
Great, so thank you for the question. I caveat everything with what I'm about to say with the fact that I'm not a trader, but I am, probably like you, absolutely fascinated by the shortening of the supply chain, whereby, and you mentioned copper, over the recent year, I think, there has been a stock of global copper no more than about 4 or 5 days. And for those of you who like your Amazon shopping, you may recall in Europe how affected we were by the Suez Canal being blocked by one vessel and the impact on everybody's lives as they couldn't get their deliveries or whatever. I find that just remarkable and scary in equal measure, I think. I think in terms of what this means for price, this means surely in respect to copper, there is a shortage, there will remain a shortage, and that that copper is going into everything from electric vehicles in massive volumes to infrastructure for electrification, etc. So it's absolutely central. It is remarkable to me that certain countries haven't yet nominated copper as a critical mineral, whereas others have. Because I think what does this mean for the future? I think the scrabble for material is going to be phenomenal, and those small and mid-tier mines are going to be relied on all the more. We heard at length just now the richness of copper and cobalt in the Congo, which is produced, as Solas said, as much as 20% purity. I mean, those are remarkable figures when you think that the world has been mining, for example, in Chile, and the purity of copper there is 0.2 or 0.3%, and that's a great number. Those mines will be mined out. We will be looking for more aggressively than ever before for material. The boundaries are going to get stretched, the limits on what we think is acceptable. At the moment, permitting times around mines, can 10, 12 years or whatever. We're going to have to try and find this is all going to have to be condensed. We're going to have to make compromises. It's going to be immensely tough. Otherwise, the price is just surely going to be at stratospheric levels, and many people will lose out, and electrification will suffer, and the goals that we've set ourselves will not be achieved. So sorry, a very long way of saying.
That.
I would like to follow up with something on this, because regarding the ore grade that you mentioned in cobalt mines in Congo, and that from the example from the presentation before. But what we see in the same time is like that the ore grades are declining all over the world. So like the energy needs that we have to mine these kind of resources will increase even further. And then the need for resources will increase even further, because we want to produce this energy, hopefully from renewable sources. So I think I mean, you said like we should rely on primary resource extraction, that we will probably to facilitate the need for resources that we see. But I think, or don't you think like demand side solutions are maybe as well necessary to decrease the demand for resources in the same time, and focus a lot on ways to recycle from secondary waste and increase this? Like we should incentivize these kind of techniques. We should promote them strongly because it gives a certain form of resilience. And I think this is also not really communicated well to the public. What does it mean? What does it mean that we replace this on a yearly basis? What does it mean that we want to have a car, an electric car? What does it mean to buy all these kind of things and not have like proper recycling in place? So I think the combination of demand side solutions, like reducing demand, and the combination of primary mining in a sustainable way should be the future forward. But we need to act much quicker than we are acting right now, because the models that we see is like that we get into the crisis in 20 years already with many materials.
Yeah, and if I may, just one final point, and that's just to build on a point you raised in there, which is to say that I was explaining this concept to my son over the weekend, that we're going to have to pay forward big time in terms of hydrocarbon consumption to be able to mine the metals to then save in time. Again, the concept that isn't well understood. To earlier points raised, I think for all of us in the sector, we have a massive amount to do by way of communicating and explaining on every single level. So we all go into this knowing whether it's compromises, etc., that we're going to have to take going forward.
No, Janne wanted to.
Yeah, can't help of adding. Very good question where the incentive prices for the commodities should be, but perhaps a couple of the points. In our commercial discussions, we have been actively introducing other pricing components than the market price. For example, our company has the target to be carbon neutral by 39, which is aligned with the European car industry. And certainly we would like to see monetary incentives to build to support also that target. So commodity price is understood, things need to be market priced, but you can add on performances, which we would be happy to share with the rest of the supply chain following with us. Then taking an example of nickel, nickel has been a market that was oversupplied decade ago by a flood of laterite ore origin supply from Indonesia. And prior that, nickel prices peaked and caused actually very positive innovations like S200 series of stainless steel with lossless nickel per unit stainless steel needed. The same we can see also in the battery sector, that there are, if the nickel is in scarcity, there are other technologies like LFP, lithium ion cathode technologies born, which certainly will help us in the total scope of transition. So I think what you were saying, there's like a positive side on it, that this may well be the mechanism that leads to more rational use of the resources in scarcity.
We discussed touch upon the concept of transparency earlier, and the fact that there is more and more demand and somehow need of transparency. The question is, how much are final users, so the ultimate market, the demand, aware of that implication? As you said, what's the geopolitical implication of me wanted a mobile phone every year, considering the amount of copper that is in my mobile phone, which is, my mobile phone is there, and considering the fact that for some objects like mobile phones, we know it's very hard to collect and recycle them or ensure those collected are properly recycled. So we know that nowadays recycling operations could be considered dissipative application as well, because they are substandard. Now, a question to the panelists is, how much is the general public aware, and what's the level of effort that we need to raise their knowledge to the proper level? I think nowadays almost everyone is aware of what's climate change somehow. Some countries more, some countries less. But from knowing what climate change is and understanding your activities when it comes to what you buy, demand, or what you dispose, recycle, still a long journey. What are your thoughts? Marco?
We engage with companies coming from all different market segments. And the answer to this question is very much market segment dependent. There are some sectors where customers drive the companies to be particularly aware of their processes and products and so on. Others where customers are absolutely ignorant, maybe because they're a bit farther away from their daily usage. We have experience in clothing, in luxury items, luxury goods, where there's a strong push to assess this type of aspects. There are other supply chains, other value chains where absolutely ignorant, that they don't care about the potential impact. And these don't compare in size. This is very much market dependent. Electronics is a gigantic sector, but I haven't seen any electronic company having a commercial claim stating their sustainability. Or I've seen it in luxury, I've seen it in other sectors. So I would say that depends a lot and varies a lot across different market segments. And we as customers have different sensibility in a very uneven way across different products we have in our households, in our cars, in our pockets. We don't have the perception of each item we have on us right now, what is its actual sustainability. And that's certainly something that needs to be worked on, an awareness that has to be brought up significantly. And even us who are working in the sector actively, I'm not fully aware of the implications of all the stuff I have in my bag and on myself. So it varies.
From a trader perspective, James, how difficult or how easy is it to propagate along the supply chain information on traceability, on the risk associated to certain operations on the ground? How easy it is? How difficult? What are the technologies that might help in that respect?
So a lot of talk about technology being the answer, of course, and facilitating the flow of information. Of course, many different vested interests as to why information doesn't flow, and that's a problem. Supply chains are, of course, incredibly complicated, and let's look at hydrocarbons and materials being blended endlessly before they actually reach your final your tank, effectively. There's no doubt that there is the demand for greater traceability for a company like Trafigura, where a lot of our business actually is quite close to point of source, if not point of source. So we can really help the process, or we can stand in the way. And what we're hearing is that there is certainly a demand for that information, and I often say, with every ton of material we supply, there's a ton of information we're now able to provide. It's not enough. There's still a huge amount of detail. Still, we've got to improve that. But we are nonetheless faced by the realities of the market, and as I say, blending and the homogenization of commodities along the way, and this information gets lost. There's a push factor, and we touched on regulation earlier, and sort of pull factor, and a huge increase in regs in the European context, well, globally, on modern slavery, on human rights, etc. And so, the diligence that we do is now being demanded by our customers. They want to see it, they want a piece of it, they want to test it. I think that provides some hope for creating that pull. But I mean, just 5 years ago, everyone was talking about blockchain. There wasn't a single conference you could go to where blockchain wasn't mentioned, and I don't know where that went. But it seems to have fallen somewhat flat. From our side, what matters is managing impact as we go. And if we can help the information flow, there's obviously currency in that. Hopefully that grows over time and we can support it.
Alison?
Yeah, no, to your point about how can we communicate to the public, I just try to always break things down in my mind. And I think, you know, in the UK, we Brexited and things like that. And I thought, how did people come to make the decision that they did? How do people come to make the decisions they do? And it's with education. So we have, you know, critical minerals strategies all across lots of parts of the world, but we could have that for education because there's consumers coming up and they're understanding there's a lot going into the environment and how you understand the environment and the implications, but not so much around the criticality of minerals, and even from a very small age, because by the time people get to, you know, being teenagers or decide to do their PhD, there's a process that happens. There are steps that happen to why you've made that decision. But for the masses and their understanding, there's lots of gaps, there's lots of disconnect. So I think being more conscious, companies, governments, NGOs, in how we communicate to, and not abusing the knowledge that we have, but how we communicate to different segments, different demographics of society is a way of you know, breaking down some of this information to understand why transparency is important, but also to understand how the mixture of metals and minerals when they're going through a plant and how hard it becomes, but then to now digitize and align systems. So there's all of this that we could do more actively. And I think that would help the public, because during COVID, we saw that everybody could stop doing certain things, but that's because there was a crisis. And we don't really want to wait for another one.
But is there a risk of, you know, overflowing with all this information? Because, I mean, when you look at, you know, companies, if you look at mining company, you have big mining company like Terrafame, and then you have small artisanal miners, and then you have this fact that, you know, I was discussing a couple of months ago with the company that was piloting the digital product passport concept with the Global Battery Alliance standard. Yes. And they told me, look, you know, we took 2 out of 25 of the criteria of the dimension that we need to map. And to map 2 of those 25, we have 400 data points to manage to deal with the modern slavery and the climate impact. Now, the question is, are we running the risk to over-engineer the need of data management to ensure transparency? Was the trade-off? Because also the question is, I think we discussed maybe a little bit over the phone, James, a couple of days ago, are all the companies able to manage that complexity? Is there such a risk?
I think there's a risk of misinformation, but I think that we have work to do with breaking things down within our respective fields. I don't think it's a bad thing to give more and more information, especially, you know, I see the possibility and the potential of what mining can do, but equally it has horrors attached to it. And to not present balanced information, I think, is more of a risk in the long term. You see disruptions, you could see, you know, I don't want to mention certain companies, but, you know, operations can be shut down when you hide information, and then all of a sudden it becomes apparent, and you lose more money that way in the long run. And then even with the geopolitical space at the moment, we have to coordinate, we have to collaborate. We've always done those things, but there's new types of collaborations and coordinations that have to happen. And people are increasingly aware. And I think we have a duty working in the sector to communicate, because this is the era as well of, well, I think there's always been fake news and misinformation, because of depending where I'm coming from, I've always seen that. But I think there is a duty on us to break down the information that we have, even in our daily lives, you with your son, me with my twins, you know, just to keep as much truth as possible, because we have mounting crisis, and it is complex, but we can break things down, and I think the public can stop things from happening as well.
The problem with sorry. Go ahead. No, I just say that one of the problems we have is that we've got big brands. We've just mentioned, you know, Polestar or you know, other big names that have to reconcile the truth of what's going on the ground with their big brand. they have, and we as the consumer have to accept, the information that I'm seeing from this big brand is shocking. I don't want to know how awful it is on site, but this is the reality. Now, making those judgments is super tough. So again, it's more work for us to do, I guess. But we want this hyper transparency. We better be ready to stomach it and have difficult conversations around it.
But then we get out of hopefully
get a better
some
situation.
of the seismic shifts that we want to see. Hopefully, sorry.
Yeah, perhaps adding just one key component here. So, topping up what colleagues were saying, there's of course the financing community that plays a key role also in creating transparency. So if a competitive advantage would be that through the transparent reporting, you get access to the reasonably priced capital. It's a powerful means. So if something good should come up from the banking world, it should be requirements set for players like ourselves to be extremely transparent in our doings. On a personal level, representing volume-wise the largest nickel mine in Europe, I sort of look back that to a lost decade. We sort of have failed to communicate the message of better in my backyard type of thinking. Shortening the supply chain, doing it yourself, that would have been a message to convey already a decade ago.
Yeah.
David.
Thank you, Federico. David Rocha from DSS Plus, like our moderator. The mining and metals supply chain has been structured by design over the decades and the centuries as a one-way street somehow. Huh? You're taking the good stuff from the mine, concentrating it, and building valuable objects that are put in the technosphere out there to a point where the concentration of gold and copper and probably other critical materials is probably higher in this room than the equivalent volume of a mine today. My question to all four of you actually is, how do you foresee beyond the shortening of the supply chain, but also the supply chain becoming a two-way street or a multi-way street with the emergence of new industrial players like circular materials and maybe one day providing trading goods, not from the mine to the user, but from the user back to the mine, so it can be reprocessed and so on. The conversations will also evolve in this sense. How quickly do you foresee this happening, and how imminent is it to impact your role in the value chains?
Yanni's already doing it, so
well, yeah, perhaps to start. So we tried to commercialize that idea by the end of this decade for sure in a meaningful volumes. And personally, I'd very much like to see one of the end users, one of the principals, taking control over their whole value chain, including the production waste and recycling. And the good news being that if companies in a position to do this would interfere today, we would start by taking care of the production waste, which for battery sector is sort of quick win for gaining efficiency. The value chain would be ready for the recycled material once it starts coming in meaningful volumes, decade or 2 decades from now.
I have a kind of small question before going back. Some companies, especially smelter, but I mean nowadays there's smelter not necessarily processing only material from recycle, but also primary concentration, are starting to have a premium price or a price to greener metal, green copper, green steel, green whatever. And I mean, of course, the moment you need to start compensating or paying or offsetting your manufacturing operations, buying material which is coming with lower carbon, of course, makes sense, and then you can decide: do I pay more a copper which is having less carbon, or do I decide to offset in other ways? So again, it's a kind of economic balance. So maybe this is more for you, James, or also for Jan. Do you foresee in the future that maybe even traceability, transparency might have a premium price? Are more transparent metal, bringing value that can be monetized?
I hope not. I think that I hope this is just a standard hygiene factor, frankly. But the reality is that where there isn't transparency, where there isn't data that can be passed down the chain in relation to ESG impacts, etc., then that material wouldn't sell. I guess maybe I am saying that there's going to be some form of premium, but I think this is just the way that we should be doing business rather than looking for additional reward. But yeah.
Perhaps picking on the word reward, because what we've been discussing openly is that there should be incentives to create value, whether it's data transparency, whether it's less waste or lower CO2 footprint, whatever creates value should be implemented in the value chain. And I personally believe that this is the direction where the commercial world will be also moving. It's okay to state that we created value by cutting half of our carbon footprint.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I would like to link into your question actually, because you said like there's more minerals in the room than there is probably in some ore quality. And I would propose legislation for this, because getting the goods back from the consumer to the recycling facilities is a nightmare. And why don't we have something like a punt for all these kind of devices, all these kind of things that we consume to bring them back? That would be an incentive to bring it back. Like there's research on this saying if you introduce 20 euros punt on a mobile phone, people would be more likely to return it because they want to have this price back for the new mobile phone that they get, and then it enters in a recycling facility like yours, and we would retrace all the resources. There's a huge problem, like holding up resources in stocks that are not used, but they are also not recycled and they are forgotten in society.
We did a study a couple of years ago on the value of this, deposit for mobile phones for France. I'm not sure that the best option was to put the deposit, because 20 euro might even not be enough for convincing someone to return their mobile phones, but definitely the need is there. I want maybe to ask Marco, you are somehow investing or expecting more recycling to take place in the future, at least with circular materials. How soon do you see that happening?
So James correctly pointed out that there are different time frames aligning on this. Okay, we know that the slowest one is always the legislation. Okay, technology tends to be quite fast, and then there is the market, which has some unpredictability features, and it's going to be fast because the pressure on raw material, the load-driven electrification is pushing a lot of dynamics that weren't seen before. My company wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago. I wouldn't have raised €0 10 years ago for what I do right now. Okay, so in 10 years, many things have changed. Many approaches have been tried. So it's going to be really fast. I think James correctly pointed out that although lithium can be partly covered by incumbent sodium chemistries. Okay, nickel, manganese, cobalt, you got LFP, and of course there's performance and other things, but technology somehow gives you a way out in terms of periodic table of metals. Okay, copper, there's no way around copper, and I'm not aware there's anything we can do about copper, and you cannot do electrification without copper. And I'm astonished, as much as James, that it's not a core aspect for everybody, because authorizing new mines takes forever. So I've really no idea how we're going to address that. As a metal recoverer, I'm quite happy that copper is going to be very valuable. And copper is one of the metals we deal with the most, because of course it's a pretty common metal in technology. So it's fairly easy to get into copper. But it's going to be fast, and it's going to come fast, and we are going to pay for it, because even recovering copper is energy, takes energy, and energy is money. So there's no way around it. whether you take it out from a 0.01% mine, or you take it out from urban mining, you take it out from recovering handheld devices or electronics, or you prolong the life of handheld devices, right? You can improve the design of electronics to accept, replace the battery, replace the screen instead of throwing away by another one. But that's just a displacement, okay? It's a time displacement. And I don't think legislation will help us because it's just not effective time-wise. So actually, my main feeling is curiosity to see how things will eventually turn up, because I have really no smart suggestion. It's just things have been rolling so fast that everything is slower, and technology can be fast, providing solution, but accepting the solution takes time on the market, and I know it very well. And so it's really interesting to see how things will develop. And of course, your solution prices will drive up. Okay, but we don't have an alternative. So I will stop electrifying. I will stop putting down cables across the ocean because it's too expensive, or what? Final customers will pay an extra in their electric bill. They will pay an extra €50 a month to absorb the increase in price in copper. I have no answers. I'm just looking as much as everybody. So it's.
I mean, we named this panel about cooperation along supply chain, and as I was mentioning in the beginning, we are probably transitioning from a situation where cooperation was accepted in the broader scheme of division of labor to a certain extent, or division of competencies along the supply chain. Now we are going through a phase where companies are more and more trying to protect their business with some vertical or downstream integration. I wonder where will be the new point of equilibrium, where there is a new form of cooperation along supply chain, without having countries to issuing a bill and eventually enforcing about I don't allow export of non-refined material, or without having you trying to close border and avoid black mass to be exported for refining, or trying to push for recycled content for new batteries for the European Union being even recycled in EU, which is somehow putting red tapes here and there. So I wonder where could be the new balance, where this new form of cooperation how it could look like. If you have your vision, doesn't necessarily need to be a prediction of the future, just your own vision on that.
Sorry, if I understand you correctly, you're saying you talked about equilibrium and cooperation. So you're talking about alignment across corporations for a new way of doing business?
Yeah, I wonder what the new form of cooperation along supply chain could look like.
Okay.
I see we are going, for me personally, to a kind of a transition phase. If you look at automotive manufacturers, automotive manufacturer taking shares in mining company of lithium is not something 10 years ago or 5 years ago we were expecting or envisioning. Now it's something that's happening. At the same time, company acquiring recycling infrastructure to secure lithium or nickel through recycling. Again, it's something I see personally, again, like a short-term or medium-term answer to a change of scenario. Like, hey, there is the war, shortage of chips, and so I do something in the short term, but maybe that's not really something that I was considering strategically 10 years ago. I wonder what will happen in 10, 15 years' time. Is this the future, or do you see other ways of cooperation? So the way Terrafem is doing a business relationship with Stellantis or Renault, is it evolving in the direction of different partnership, or the way you trade commodities? How do you see this evolving? If you look 10 years into the future.
I think I need a very big bottle of
wine.
red wine to help me with that. But what I
Predictions
to
and
make
predictions.
predictions. But what I would say, and I think as a company, we have to work very hard on, and perhaps this ties in a little bit to what Alison's sort of previous work, certainly in setting up the EITI, is that we have to get better at working across sectors. And I think that a big concern that I have is the decline, if you like, of civil society and voice, which it's certainly in a lot of the producer countries that we deal with, we see civil society being shrunk, and that's a big problem. You know, I think we were talking about beneficiation earlier, you know, companies being more open to engaging with governments to support their development needs and aspirations around beneficiation. I think we can do it as companies anyway. We can do an awful lot to get comfortable with the concept of multi-stakeholder dialogue and supporting it, so we can perhaps get slightly better at crystal ball.
Yeah.
Whatever it is.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think some of the companies who I won't name that we're working with, because I haven't got consent, we're working with a car company, and they want increased visibility across their supply chain, and they also have arrangements with the perhaps creating mining companies of their own. And then some of the exploration companies that we're working with using AI and the like, they are coming from, their perspectives are coming from companies that are buying these materials. So they're now entering into the mining space and trying to understand it at the point of exploration. So there's lots of, to your point, there's lots of these integrated ways of working that are becoming part of the transition. There's lots of multi-stakeholder dialogues that are being had, but they need to be effective. So what that looks like is that after the conversation, something's created which solves a problem, because there has been a lot of talk, but that's why for DPI, at least, as soon as a conversation is had, okay, what does this mean? Let's test it, let's go. And that can mean you fail sometimes and it goes horribly wrong, but at least, you know, just being in the space of taking action.
Is it more risk management, or is it really trying to change the way you do business?
Some people or organizations will approach it as that. But then I remember even when I worked with certain organizations or certain leaders in the UK and everything, and people had all sorts of ideas. Oh, you shouldn't be working with this person. You shouldn't interact with this person. But I think we're all a part of it. And there will be some people that approach it from a risk management perspective. 20 years ago, we talked about corporate social responsibility, and everybody had that at the periphery, the easy thing, the social sciencey type thing, not very hard. And now it's front and center of securing operations. So there is a risk management aspect to it. But I think increasingly, just to instill hope, there is an understanding of humanity that we want to keep talking, we want to keep inventing, we want to keep discovering, we want to keep alive innovation. And it's a doom and gloom time, but it's also an exciting time. New technologies, new things are becoming, and there's new learning. So it's a tested environment. The risk management will always be there. Some people will always look at it through the lens of profit and making money or competition. That's always going to be there, but increasingly the evidence base is being built for something else. So if your house goes on fire, or you have flood, all of a sudden you start thinking about things a little bit differently. If you watch your mother or father die in front of your very eyes with some kind of risk, your perspective changes. Oh, this is not so much about money anymore. It's about something else. And I think being involved in these types of conversations, having different platforms, learning from each other, not just saying, oh, I'm from the global south. So, there's dynamics, historical dynamics, which can make us stay in our place. But I think, opening up conversation is helpful as long as it turns into something.
Question here.
May a totally illiterate person put a question?
Please.
Yeah, I can prove I am illiterate. I am a journalist and I am accidentally here. I'm not a trade journalist. And of course, I'm a bit lost as an illiterate, but the advantage of being lost is that you start asking yourself very basic questions you wouldn't otherwise. So I understand that there are several ways to break down resources, what resources. You have the renewable, non-renewables, etc. But if I am right, there is a difference between organic and non-organic material. If I'm not mistaken, the quantity of water present on Earth since the formation of Earth is the same. It may change phase, it can go, but basically it is. The same for copper, the same for iron, the same for silicium. It can sometimes combine into simple non-organic rocks, but still it is the same. With fossil resources, it's totally different. You have two issues. One is the mining, and that you have the same with iron and copper. And the second one is the stuff itself, which will eventually, in most cases, be burned and change nature, change chemical nature. And I feel that I rarely hear that distinction being made in discussions. Of course, we recycle aluminium, that's very much more easy than recycling burnt coal. But I rarely heard this distinction being made. Is that distinction irrelevant?
Is the point that the resources are finite?
I believe so.
Okay. No, I just wanted to
Point of clarification.
understand your question, and I think I do now. Thank you.
Anyone want to react or?
If I understood the question correctly, it's by no means, it's the point of relevancy. It's not irrelevant. What has not been mined or grown before cannot be recycled. And a challenge, the positive thing with most of the metal is that they can endlessly be recycled. Our challenge as an industry for nickel or copper or aluminum today is to accumulate enough of materials for the future generations to increase the share of recycling.
Thank you.
Marco, you want to?
Yes, absolutely. No, I think the aspect of fossil fuels, so non-renewable resources, somehow in the general conversation is absorbed in the CO2 monitoring aspect, okay? So the carbon dioxide somehow accounts for the burning of fossil fuels, okay? So it's kind of, it's quite close enough to be a sufficient control check and check for the usage of fossil fuels. Now, I'm not sure what are the current estimates on how many megajoules of fossil fuels we have left. I know this number has been increasing, but clearly the decision has been made to move away from fossil fuels into electrification. And clearly this, in such a short span of time, poses the challenges we were discussing before into, you need a lot of electric cables to make everything electric, and you need a lot of copper and so on. But again, fossil fuels will not necessarily disappear. In 2035, coal reservoirs, gas reservoirs, oil reservoirs will still be there. So there's still a resource which has a very big downside, which is contribution to carbon dioxide and to global warming and so on, but it's still there. So it's a matter of balancing the cost of using that versus the cost, and by cost, I take it in the broader possible way, okay, of doing something else, of extracting copper, aluminum, and so on. And clearly, people here have a strong opinion on that, given what we're working on, okay? But that's still something that is debatable somehow. It's not a given.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you a question back as well, actually. You said extraction. What are your views on extraction versus urban mining and recycling? What's your perspective on that? Just wanted to learn what underpins your question.
I have no view whatsoever. I am just sometimes a bit disturbed by the confusion of the activist debates on this kind of issues. And that's why I try to clarify in my mind. I have absolutely no qualification to, of course, recycling probably is less polluting than extracting. We always have, have a lot of extraction scandals. I rarely have heard of a big aluminium recycling scandal, but apart from that, I have no light to.
No,
No, I
because
think-
there is less recycling than extraction, but we have also scandals, I would say. In the
Yeah, you're
recycling.
surprised, but yeah.
So we did some studies with along responsible sourcing with young people and some of the PhD students as well from Latin America, Africa, and Australia. And they had different perspectives as to what was important. Definitely on the Australian side, there were young people who felt that urban mining was the way forward, and that mining should be reduced. People in Latin America and Africa felt that mining is also a good trajectory for development, for socioeconomic development. So there were different perspectives. But then in some of our conversations that we're having, we are creating something called the Resco Community Collective. And you might have a decision not to mine in some of these conversations. So there's different perspectives that come across the mining. So extraction versus recycling versus, this, and what that means for a project will be interesting, but there is space to have those types of conversations because interacting with the community might not always mean that you mine.
Did you want to get to?
Thanks. Hi, I'm Leopold. I'm a PhD student at ETH Zurich. And I have a question going back to also what we heard in the plenum before on cobalt mining. And also in this session now, we discussed that industrial and artisanal mining cannot always be differentiated well. And maybe 3 years ago or something, this controversial topic of formalization of artisanal mining was quite dominant in the industry and in the media. And I was just and I realized that Trafigura had a flagship project on that, if I remember well. So I just wanted and I didn't hear a lot on that in the recent years. So I was wondering, not specifically on the Trafigura thing, but in the industry, what are your thoughts and what are the recent developments, and do you see a future in the formalization of this dynamic? Thank you.
I wish I could say I placed this individual in the audience because this is a topic that I absolutely love. And furthermore, having lectured at ETHZ, I'm delighted perhaps there was someone in the audience who was listening, because the need for getting our heads around formalization is just so present from my perspective. Having come from a big mining company and having engaged with many other miners over a long period of time, the concept of artisanal mining and formalization was hated and laughed out of the room. And I've always believed that actually there's a real place for formalization. And we proved that with a particular project that we were running in the Congo, in Kolwezi, that is actually referenced in Solar's book, and not necessarily in good terms, but nonetheless, it was an attempt to formalize 5,000 artisanal miners, their artisanal mining situation on a particular concession. And it was run from 2018 to 2020. It was one of the most exciting times of my professional career, because the differences we created were just absolutely phenomenal. The socioeconomic benefits are well described in academic literature now. And it was just very sad from my perspective, and hopefully I think 5,000 people's perspective who were on site, that we weren't able to continue. I had to pull the plug on that particular project because COVID hit, and I could not sit here in Geneva and justify bringing 5,000 people into close proximity every single day. And if you cast your mind back to the year 2000, there was year 2020, sorry, there was so much uncertainty around COVID and controls, or whether you could indeed have controls. So we stopped the project. There were other reasons as well, including economic, as to why the project didn't make sense in that climate at the time, which is a very low, very depressed cobalt price. The concept around formalization, is really building again, and for good reason, because if you look at the world's mining population, 90% of the world's miners are artisanal miners. And it's producing as much as 20% of all of the metals and minerals that we see around us. So the numbers are really, really interesting. And from a trading perspective, I'm just loving getting involved here because we're buying material from all over the world, and I see precisely where the artisanal mining is, and I see nothing but scope for improvement, shall we say. So the conversation hasn't stopped. I was relieved. I was going to be one of those annoying people in Serdar's presentation to put my hand up and said, so what's the solution? Because he only devoted one sentence to formalization, and that is the solution. I'm absolutely convinced about that, and I have spent enough time on the ground in many, many different countries to know that when a buyer takes a real interest in improving the situation on the ground, and furthermore can generate interest from the downstream, as we did, massive brands saying, I like what you're doing, Trafigura, but because of the nature of our brand, I'm not willing to put my name on the label to say I'm supporting it, but I'm supporting it. Actually what we need, as Serdar said, is a big company coming forward. Microsoft has already done that earlier this year when they said, we believe that formalization of cobalt makes so much sense. It enables individuals on the ground in these impoverished situations to actually have a stake, a piece of the pie in the transition, to raise them out of poverty, to improve their working conditions. In that 2-year project that we ran, something in the region of 3 million worked hours, not a single fatality. It sounds crazy that is even an achievement, but it's a hell of an achievement. And you know what's crazy? Even more crazy was the interventions that we made were so unbelievably, stupidly simple. It was stop digging tunnels, wear PPE, here's clean potable water and ablutions, etc., that we're going to provide. It was cheap. It was economic. We made money. They made money. The miner made money in that climate. Now I want to bring it back.
Thank you, James.
One short follow-up question, if you allow me to be the annoying person now. Are there follow-up projects planned then for Trafigura? If you said it was a win-win where both sides had benefits and the project only lasted 2 years and was stopped because of COVID?
Yeah. So the biggest project for me, the biggest KPI that I have is there are 200,000 artisanal cobalt miners in the DRC, and Trafigura has partnered with the Congolese government around buying from formalized artisanal cobalt mines. And I see real hope in raising those 200,000 people out of that dire situation, the situation you saw. Making that happen requires a lot to change. Part of that is the international cobalt price, which means it's not actually economic right now. Actually, artisanal miners, he mentioned Kosulo, one particular site. How many people are on that site right now? Back when Serdar was on site, it was 12,000. Right now, 20, 50? Because the diggers have moved on. Where have they gone? Copper. So yes, copper and cobalt found together in high concentration, but that's where the artisanal diggers are focused. So loads of scope, projects not only in the DRC but also in LATAM that I'm quite excited by. So get involved.
Thank you for the question. Thank you, James. Also, we are almost late, but good things takes time. At least 9 months usually. So it takes time. So let's keep the commitment. Thank you all for the debate, the question, the answer. We are more than welcome to continue over the coffee break with our speakers. For me, it was really interesting discussion and learning new things and perspectives. So thank you again. Hope you enjoyed. I hope also people that were online could follow the debate and the discussion. I don't know if there were questions from online, but in case we can get those questions and channel back to the speakers.